Windsor Castle. During the years when Queen Victoria's young family was growing up within its walls, most people picture her as she appeared in the later, more photographed decades of her reign. An elderly widow dressed in black, seated at a writing desk with a stern expression fixed on her face. That picture belongs to a woman in her 60s and 70s. 2 or 3 decades earlier, mornings inside Windsor Castle looked very different. A household of several hundred people worked to a fixed timetable long before its mistress opened her eyes. A husband had made himself her working partner at a shared desk, and the business of governing an empire arrived at her door each day inside a red leather box. What did a working morning at Windsor actually involve? From the moment she woke to the moment the business of the day gave way to whatever came next. This account follows a fairly typical morning from the 2 decades of her marriage, the years during which Windsor functioned less as a monarch's residence and more as the household of a large working family that also happened to run an empire. Long before the Queen stirred, the lower floors of the castle were already occupied. Windsor in this period covered close to 1,000 rooms across the upper and lower wards, standing on some 13 acres of walls, towers, and courtyards first laid out in the 11th century and rebuilt on a grand scale for George IV during the 1820s. Keeping it running took a staff that numbered, across the whole of Victoria's reign, above 900 people, organized into 3 separate departments. The Lord Steward's department covered the kitchens, the wine cellars, and the porters and general laborers who kept the building supplied. The Lord Chamberlain's department covered the ceremonial side of the household and everyone in personal attendance on the Queen, from her titled ladies down to her housekeepers and housemaids. A third department, under the Master of the Horse, ran the stables and the royal mews. Before Prince Albert reorganized this system in the 1840s, authority over the domestic side of the household had been so weak that servants were later said to have come and gone largely as they pleased, answering to no one in particular. Albert gave the master of the household direct control over the below-stairs staff, and it was this reformed structure that got the castle ready every morning. Housemaids rose in the dark to clean out grates, lay fresh fires, and put the private apartments in order before the family occupying them woke, working under a housekeeper who was answerable for every candle, every length of linen, and every jar of preserves in the storerooms. Messengers, palace inspectors, and a handful of ceremonial officers whose posts dated back centuries, including heralds and sergeants-at-arms with no real function left beyond appearing at state occasions, rounded out a court whose numbers, added together, approached 1,000 people. If the royal standard was raised over the round tower rather than the ordinary flag, it meant the family was in residence and the household worked accordingly. The private apartments themselves had been largely rebuilt for George IV in a mixture of styles his architect favored, then altered again under Victoria and Albert, so that grand Georgian rooms stood alongside newer Gothic touches added during their own married life. Even with fires lit before dawn in every occupied room, the castle's stone corridors held the cold for hours afterward, and its long library was known even within the family as nearly impossible to heat properly. At around 7:30, in a bedroom within the private apartments on the south side of the upper ward, the Queen woke. The room she used lay within the tower at the castle's southeast corner that would later carry her name, looking south over Windsor Great Park and the Long Walk, the avenue running for 3 miles from the castle gates. A sitting room, a boudoir, and a dressing room adjoined the bedroom itself, reached from the rest of the private apartments along a corridor close to 500 feet long, known simply as the Grand Corridor, that ran the length of the south wing. The Queen generally rose about 3/4 of an hour after waking, closer to 8:15. From 1843 onward, her mornings at Windsor, as at her other residences, opened with the sound of a single bagpiper playing beneath her window for 1/4 of an hour, a position she had created that year, and which her household maintained for the rest of the century. A servant would already have passed through the room once, bringing hot water and drawing back the curtains without disturbing her outright. Waking the Queen properly and helping her into the first stage of dress was the task of her personal dresser. For most of the 1840s and 50s, that dresser was a woman named Mary Ann Scarrett, who had entered the Queen's service at her accession in 1837 and remained until 1862. Scarrett held the title of principal dresser, ranking above the second and third dressers, and the wardrobe maids under her, and she carried personal responsibility for everything the Queen wore. Gowns, shoes, gloves, bonnets, and underclothes were ordered through her, their bills checked line by line against what had actually been delivered, and any repairs assigned to the wardrobe maids in her charge. After 1842, when the Queen's former governess Baroness Letson left England for good, Scarrett effectively took her place as the person on the household staff the Queen trusted most, closer to her in daily terms than most of the titled ladies who attended at court. Dressing followed a fixed sequence: washing first, then the underclothes, then the corset laced and adjusted, then the chosen gown fastened down the back with a long line of small buttons that needed a second pair of hands to close. A morning at Windsor called for one of the plainer day dresses in the wardrobe rather than anything elaborate. Low necklines, jewels, and delicate fabrics were kept for the afternoon, and especially the evening, and a woman of the Queen's rank was expected to change her dress several times before the day was over. Under the visible gown lay several further layers most people never saw: a chemise, drawers, stiffened petticoats to hold the skirt's shape, and stockings held above the knee, all put on in careful order before the corset went over them, and the dress went on last of all. Hair came last, brushed out fully with silver-backed brushes, then arranged and pinned, a job skilled enough that a good dresser was effectively a trained hairdresser as well as a wardrobe manager. Prince Albert went through a simpler version of the same process down the corridor, in his own rooms, dressed by his personal valet, rather than by Scarrett's department, though on the same fixed schedule, so that the two of them could begin the day's business together. Breakfast followed at around 9:30. Depending on the season, it might be taken indoors. In the oak room within the private apartments, a room hung with tapestries the King of France had given the Queen in 1843, and fitted with a clock topped by a carved figure of Time, or outdoors, in a tent set up on the lawn at Frogmore, a house within Windsor's home park that the family used for informal meals whenever the weather allowed, with the piper again playing somewhere nearby. Household accounts describe the meal as plain by the standards of the Queen's class and century. Fish when it was available, eggs served on toast or simply boiled, dry toast alongside a small selection of what contemporaries called fancy toast, and tea. The eggs themselves came from a flock of white Dorking hens kept at Windsor for that purpose. It was a modest spread next to what men of similar rank were often served elsewhere in the country at the same hour, tables that ran to chops, game, and deviled kidneys before the working day had properly begun. London's poorer households, by contrast, had usually finished their bread and tea by daybreak, hours before the Queen sat down to hers, while some of the wealthiest households in the country delayed breakfast even later than 9:30. The Queen and Albert breakfasted privately, but the wider court staying at the castle at the same time did not join them. Visiting ministers, equerries, and members of the household breakfasted separately in one of two designated rooms, one for the ladies and guests, and the other for the equerries, so that several unconnected breakfasts were underway in different parts of the castle at more or less the same hour. After breakfast, the working part of the morning began, and this was where the routine of these particular years differed most sharply from what had come before and what would come after. In her first years as Queen, before her marriage in 1840, the hour or two after breakfast had belonged to her Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, who acted as her informal advisor on state business, because no official post of private secretary existed yet. Melbourne had filled that gap so completely in her first years on the throne that he sat beside her for several hours of most days, an arrangement several of his own cabinet colleagues considered excessive for a serving prime minister to maintain with his sovereign. After her marriage, that role passed increasingly to her husband. Albert held no constitutional position of his own, but he set up his own desk beside hers, just as he later would at Buckingham Palace, so the two of them could work through her papers together, and by the mid-1840s he was functioning, in every sense but the title, as her private secretary, a post that would not exist officially until 1861. He built the filing system that organized her state papers by subject and by correspondent, going through documents in advance and marking the points she most needed to see. One diarist who observed the couple at close range in these years described their approach to government business as almost entirely joined together, with Albert taking real interest in matters the Queen herself found tedious. Each morning brought a dispatch box, one of the red leather cases newly introduced in this decade for carrying state papers between the sovereign and her ministers. The color is usually traced to Albert's own preference, red having featured prominently in the coat of arms of his family, the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, though an older story ties the color back to royal correspondence under Elizabeth I 3 centuries earlier. Inside the box were dispatches from every government department, the Foreign Office and the Home Office chief among them, along with reports arriving from India and the colonies, so that for an hour or two each morning the Queen's writing room became, in effect, the working center of an empire spread across several continents. She was expected to read the dispatches in full rather than in summary, noting her views in the margins for Albert to work into a reply. On fixed days, a minister, most often the Prime Minister himself, arrived for an audience in a room within the South Range, kept for that purpose, close to her own apartments, a meeting that could run well past an hour, working through the government's business point by point, while the rest of the household kept well clear of that part of the castle. Alongside government papers came the Queen's own private correspondence, which by itself would have filled most people's mornings. She had kept a daily journal since the age of 13, a habit her governess Letson had first instructed her in, and which her mother had once checked each day, and as an adult she combined journal writing with letter writing into a daily output estimated at around 2,500 words, repeated almost without a break for most of her adult life. Over the course of her reign, that adds up to more than 60 million words in total and well over 100 bound volumes of journal alone, eventually kept together in a bookcase built for the purpose at Windsor. When she traveled, it was one of her wardrobe maids who took charge of the current volume and saw that it went wherever she went. Letters went out constantly to relatives scattered across the royal houses of Europe, to former members of her household living in retirement, and to ministers and courtiers on business ranging from state affairs to the smallest personal favor. A careless word in a letter that reached the wrong hands could become a public embarrassment for the crown, so this private correspondence demanded nearly the same care as any state paper. She was also careful about keeping a record of what she had actually written, since a sovereign's letters had a way of resurfacing years later in someone else's hands, and a fixed portion of the morning went toward this correspondence before the rest of the day's business could proceed. Household matters also needed the Queen's attention most mornings, though by the 1840s far less of the daily detail reached her directly than would have been the case a generation before. The master of the household, empowered by Albert's reforms, dealt with the greater part of it without troubling her. What still reached the Queen personally usually came through her dresser or her housekeeper, a servant who needed to be taken on or let go, a delivery from a tradesman in London, a repair required somewhere in the state rooms. Scarrett, in her charge over the wardrobe, checked every bill that arrived from dressmakers, milliners, and jewelers before it went forward for payment, a task that demanded a good head for figures and a sharp eye for being overcharged. She also handled the correspondence that came with running a wardrobe of that size, writing to tradesmen and answering the begging letters that reached the castle by every post. The castle's housekeeper, responsible in turn for the linen, the store cupboards, and the general conduct of the housemaids, reported separately on the domestic side of the building. From 1855 onward, that housekeeper was a woman named Eliza Jane Thornton, whose duties ran from the linen inventory to the general behavior expected of the female staff, and who took her problems to the master of the household rather than to the Queen directly. By one contemporary account, the household at Windsor alone ran to some 60 housemaids working under 9 housekeepers later in the reign. Between the dresser and the housekeeper, most of the daily friction that in a smaller house would have gone straight to the mistress never reached the Queen at all. The women who surrounded the Queen through these morning hours were arranged in a strict order of rank. At the top stood the mistress of the robes, always a duchess, appointed along political lines and replaced whenever the government changed hands. The post carried enough party affiliation that in 1839, the Queen's refusal to replace her Whig-affiliated ladies of the bedchamber with women chosen by an incoming Tory government had briefly brought down an attempt to form a new administration altogether, an episode remembered afterward as the bedchamber crisis. The mistress of the robes herself had duties that were largely ceremonial, though she also kept a general oversight of the Queen's wardrobe bills. Below her came the ladies of the bedchamber, wives of peers who served in rotation, usually 2 or 3 turns of duty a year lasting anywhere from 12 days to a month, with only one on duty at the castle at any given time. Below them again, the women of the bedchamber were not required to live permanently at court, but had to be ready to attend the Queen at short notice whenever called. At the bottom of this particular hierarchy, though far from unimportant to the daily life of the court, were the maids of honor, young unmarried women of noble family chosen personally by the Queen, 2 of whom were on duty at any one time, required to live at court for the length of their service, and given a substantial sum of money as a gift, reportedly as much as £1,000, whenever one of them eventually married. Most of these ladies were free to do as they pleased through the earlier part of the morning, since their formal attendance was not usually required until luncheon, when carriages were sent to collect whichever of them were currently off duty and living in their own houses nearby. Somewhere in the middle of the morning, time was set aside for the nursery, which by the mid-1840s held several children and would eventually hold 9. The 2 eldest, Victoria, born in 1840, and Albert Edward, born in 1841, had been joined by the rest of their brothers and sisters over the following decade, so that by 1850 the nursery had passed 7 children through it. From 1842 to 1850, the nursery was run day to day by Sarah, Lady Littleton, appointed superintendent of the royal children at the Queen's own request. The children called her Laddle, and she managed their schedules, supervised their nurses, and oversaw the earliest stages of their education. Shortly after the birth of the first child, Albert had written out his own detailed memorandum on the duties of everyone involved in the nursery, and Baron Stockmar, a close advisor to the family, followed it with a much longer paper on the educational principles to be applied to the children as they grew older. The Queen's own visits to the nursery during the morning tended to be brief and somewhat formal, a matter of duty fitted between other appointments rather than an extended part of her day. Prince Albert, by most accounts, took the closer personal hand in his children's early education, particularly once lessons in languages, history, and constitutional matters began in earnest as they grew older. French was introduced almost from infancy, and German alongside it, since Albert wanted his children raised comfortably bilingual from the start. By the time the youngest of the 9, Beatrice, was born in 1857, the eldest, Victoria, was already a young woman preparing for her own marriage into the Prussian royal family. Even so, a visit to see the children was treated as one of the fixed points of the morning at Windsor, however short it turned out to be. By the time the morning's business wound down, midday was approaching, and what came next depended on the season and the day of the week. In her earlier years especially, it often meant a ride through Windsor Great Park, taken side saddle as etiquette required of any lady, sometimes at a full gallop, with a large party of household members and guests riding alongside her for an hour or 2. On other days it meant a walk along the Long Walk instead, or nothing more than moving straight through to luncheon with whichever family members and guests were currently staying at the castle. Guests staying at Windsor were generally expected to join whichever activity was chosen, since the castle offered few organized amusements between meals. One visitor in these years noted that the billiard room sat almost unused in a distant corner of the building, and that the library, however well stocked, was rarely warm enough to sit in for long. Windsor itself had not always been a favorite of the Queen's. Early in her reign, she was known to describe it as dull and confining. Well before her marriage, and growing family filled it with a different kind of life. Mornings built around a shared desk, a red dispatch box, and a brief nursery visit squeezed between audiences continued in this pattern for as long as Albert was alive. After his death at Windsor in December 1861, the household that had run these mornings for 2 decades was reorganized once again, and the Queen's own daily routine, along with her relationship to the castle itself, changed for the remainder of her long reign.